Hello all, and welcome to Let's Read Chapter 1 of Is God a Delusion by Reitan. This is a video series where I read through and respond to this Christian apologetics book from my skeptical lay perspective. In this video, I'll be covering all of the first chapter of the book, titled On Religion and Equivocation. Like a good philosopher, Reitan starts his book by defining his terms, or rather by berating others for not defining their terms adequately. He begins by giving an overview of Bertrand Russell's 1927 speech and essay, Why I'm Not a Christian. This is introduced because Reitan sees Russell's work as being a direct ancestor of the new atheism. Reitan's summary of Russell's views is this. For Russell, the concept of God is that of a terrible tyrant in the sky, dispensing arbitrary rules and ruthlessly punishing those who question his authority. The cowering masses, terrified of the world and its dangers, project their fears into the heavens, imagining this cosmic tyrant who, while deadly and capricious, can be appeased. Out of their efforts at appeasement, religion is born. Reitan takes issue with this view of God and religion, arguing that these are hardly the only possible conceptions, and that many people don't hold to these ideas. But that's a straw man of Russell's position. Russell isn't arguing that literally every religion is exactly like this, nor that every religion must be like this, but rather that this seems to be how religions have formed. Later religions grew out of earlier religions, and earlier religions did venerate tyrannical, vindictive gods. This may not hold in every case, but certainly Christianity, which remember was what he was actually arguing against, holds to this pattern. But Reitan's point here is really to poison the well, by suggesting that anti-theists' criticisms of religion are founded in equivocating. He tries to suggest that Russell has missed the many other concepts of God or understandings of religion, but this is patently not the case. Rather, Russell had a particular religion in mind, and he argued against it well. This section consists of Reitan exploring the many different ways in which we use the word religion. He starts by giving a variety of usages to make it clear the range of meanings. When we use the term religion, we might mean a system of doctrines. Then again, we might mean a body of explanatory myths, or a social institution organised around shared beliefs and ritual practices, or the personal convictions of an individual, or a person's sense of relatedness to the divine. Sometimes we treat it as synonymous with comprehensive worldview, and other times as synonymous with spirituality. His point here is that if we want to make an argument about whether religion is useful, or true, or harmful, then we need to be clear about how we are defining the term. But more than this, Reitan is trying to impress upon us how tricky it can be to talk about religion. He wants us to think that writing plainly about religion is impossible due to the complexity of having to consider the various meanings. He puts it like this. This is the treacherous conceptual quagmire into which Bertrand Russell waded 80 years ago, and into which the new atheists slog cavalierly today. To his credit, Dawkins tries to define his terms, but he fails to do so with a philosopher's care, and he is too swept up in his own rhetoric, the joyous successes that make his attacks on religion so entertaining, at least to those who aren't deeply offended by them. Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, by contrast, never define their terms, leaving it up to their readers to figure out what they are so fervently attacking when they attack religion. What Reitan is implying here is that philosophy of religion is simply too complex for non-experts to do, unlike professional philosophers like himself. This is simply poisoning the well, rather than addressing the merits of the argument. And to claim that their definitions, or lack of, are the problem, is to largely miss the point of their works. Dawkins, Harris and Hitchens are all popular authors who write for a general audience, about religion as it is commonly understood and practiced. Their works argue stridently against religion in the common usage of the word, and as it is generally found. Their works are not academic philosophical treatises aimed at rigorously disproving even the mere possibility of every concept of God. Rather, they are aimed squarely at the kinds of religions and gods that people actually practice and believe in. But this objection to the new atheists not defining their terms, with what Reitan calls a philosopher's care, will be a common thread throughout this chapter. The rest of this section is Reitan explaining a number of different understandings of the term religion, and the various difficulties with each of them. What this boils down to is that the common understanding of the term is not rigorous, and any attempt to define it rigorously seems to have problems with edge cases. that is, whether we use Paul Griffiths' definition, William James's, Emile Durkheim's, or John Hick's, we can always find examples that will fit the explicit definition, but that we would not intuitively consider religions. And while Reitan makes out that this is a special problem in the philosophy of religion, this is little more than a result of our vague lay sense about what the term means. Similar problems occur in almost every technical field. Very often, some lay concept is too vague, and the technical definitions can't precisely capture these meanings without either excluding seemingly valid examples or including seemingly invalid examples. Medical definitions of death, zoological definitions of birds, physics definitions of now, psychological definitions of feelings, and legal definitions of firearms all have similar problems. There is nothing intrinsically more complicated about philosophy of religion, but it serves Reitan's purposes to make it seem so, as it suggests that critics of religion aren't well informed, and that readers shouldn't try to make sense of this themselves. In this section, Reitan starts by taking aim at Christopher Hitchens, particularly his book God is Not Great. In it, Hitchens argues that two paragons of Christian morality, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King Jr., were best understood as motivated by an admirable but nebulous humanism, rather than as directly inspired by their faith. Reitan puts it like this. So, in Hitchens' view, an ethic of love and forgiveness is less central to Christianity than the doctrine of hell. Someone who believes that God is love and claims to have experienced that love as a source of spiritual support can turn out, on Hitchens' account, not to be a Christian in anything but a nominal sense. Hitchens' argument, as best I understand it, is that if we examine the professed motivations of such people, they bear little resemblance to either the biblical account of Jesus' teachings or the Christianity that most follow. Again, Reitan will argue that simply because they have chosen to emphasise a rare subset of Christianity does not render them non-Christians. But in an important sense it does, and that's what Hitchens is arguing. If your definition of what it means to be Christian differs so radically from the vast majority of Christians, both contemporaneously and historically, then it makes little sense to call it Christianity. And it is disingenuous to claim that Christianity motivated them, when it certainly didn't motivate the vast majority of Christians to behave that way. Whatever prompted people like Bonhoeffer and King, it wasn't Christianity, as most people would understand it, which is what Hitchens was arguing against. Reitan misses this though, and as with Dawkins, he gets Hitchens' arguments backwards, confusing premises for conclusions. On Hitchens' definition of religion, Reitan puts it like this. Instead of offering his own account, Hitchens' strategy seems to be this. If it is good, noble, or tends to inspire compassion, then it isn't religion. It is humanism or something of the sort. With no clear definition to guide him, Hitchens is free to locate only what is cruel, callous, insipid, or banal in the camp of religion, while excluding anything that could reliably motivate the heroic moral action exemplified by Bonhoeffer and King. When religion is never defined, but in practice is treated so that only what is poisonous qualifies, it becomes trivially easy to conclude that religion poisons everything. Except that this isn't what Hitchens actually does. What he does is look at the actual history of religion and catalogues the endless variety of atrocities committed by people in its name. And he looks at the actual forces for progress and sees that reform, at least in the last several centuries, has almost always been a secular enterprise. Combine this with his oft-repeated challenge to name a single moral act performed by a believer that could not be performed by an atheist, and he makes a compelling case that religion is a force for evil in the world. That moral actions are unrelated to religious beliefs, but that much immoral action stems from religious belief is a strong argument against the value of religion. But Reitan again mistakes Hitchens' conclusion that religion poisons everything with his premise that religion is irrational. It's not that Hitchens has failed to define by what he means by religion, it's that he squarely targeted religion as it actually is, not the hypothetical religions of the philosopher. Reitan then returns to Dawkins and his distinguishing between Einsteinian religion from supernatural religion. Einstein famously described himself as religious, but his religion was entirely atheistic. Despite this unusual use of the word, religious apologists have used quotes from Einstein to argue for religion ever since. And Dawkins makes clear that this is a often willful misunderstanding of what Einstein meant. Einstein himself described his religion as humility and unbounded admiration that thoughtful people feel when they contemplate the magnificent structure of the universe. Reitan's purpose here is to argue that Einstein was actually religious in a sense that is meaningful for his case. That is, since Einstein described his religion in terms of a feeling, this puts him in line with Schleiermacher's definition of religion. Quote, "By feeling, Schleiermacher didn't mean some rush of emotion, but rather a kind of primal experience, or perhaps better, a way of experiencing. He called it the feeling of piety, and in the speeches he tried to describe it as the awareness of the infinite in the finite. Later, in his magnum opus, the Glaubenslehre, usually translated as the Christian faith, he described it as the feeling of absolute dependence. Sometimes, instead of feeling, he used the term self-consciousness, although it is clear that what we are conscious of in our experience of piety is not our isolated ego, but the self in relation to something beyond us." There are several problems here. Firstly, there is nothing in Einstein's description of religion that implies that what he was talking about was anything more than a normal human emotion, which Schleiermacher is explicitly ruling out. Einstein was describing a profound sense of awe, but here Reitan is aiming for something else. And that's the second problem. I have really no idea what he's getting at here if he isn't just talking about emotion. And the worst thing is that this is as close to a definition of religion as Reitan gets in this chapter. He spends most of this chapter, and some of the introduction, criticising the new atheists for not giving clear definitions of what they mean by the word religion. And yet this passage was the closest I could find to him presenting a definition of his own. And this is from a professional philosopher, no less. Even here, he hasn't explicitly claimed this description, for it isn't really a definition, as his own, instead attributing it to Schleiermacher. I can only infer that Reitan agrees completely, since nowhere does he present a definition of his own. Anyway, he continues to claim that since Einstein described his religion as a feeling, and Schleiermacher did too, that therefore they were talking about the same thing. Reitan makes the distinction between religion and theology, defining religion as the experience of such a feeling, and theology as our explanations of it. He explains it like this. But given Schleiermacher's view of religion, his differences with Einstein are not on the level of religion in its primary sense. They both experience the feeling that is religion's essence. Where they differ is in their theology, that is, in how they explain the feeling to themselves and others. While Schleiermacher would certainly have disagreed with Einstein's theology, he would have had no grievance at all with Einstein's religion. What Reitan is trying to do here is to define the term religion in such a way as to shift any disagreements into the category of theology. The whole point of Einstein's use of the word religion was that it was explicitly non-theistic, naturalistic, and potentially atheistic. He emphatically wasn't using it in a way that Schleiermacher would agree with, and only by shifting those parts of religion into theology can Reitan make this argument. And it fails anyway. Reitan anticipates the atheist response, that either what is meant by the word religion includes some belief in a supernatural God, or it doesn't, and the God delusion is targeted directly at the supernatural definitions. This is a very good point, and it would be nice to know if Reitan's definition, or Schleiermacher's, of religion includes a mandatory belief in the supernatural. Reitan doesn't actually address this, instead simply pointing out that a belief in a supernatural God comes in many different forms. This is true, but beside the point. Any belief in supernatural agency comes under attack in most new atheist works, regardless of the precise details of the belief, which Reitan acknowledges. His response is this. Imagine an author who sets out to prove that music glorifies violence, but who spends most of the book fixated on gangster rap, and then attributes the vices of the latter to music in general. When he tries to make the case that religion is pernicious, Dawkins moves willy-nilly from an attack on particular religious doctrines and communities to conclusions about religion and belief in God generally, and this, of course, is entirely typical of religion's cultured despisers. This is a false analogy. Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris don't claim that the majority of religion is bad because of the actions of a minority. They actually argue that the majority of religious people hold false and harmful views about reality, and that many people have acted on these beliefs. This would be like arguing that music glorifies violence because 90% of it is gangster rap, and the rest is R&B that promotes unhealthy views of relationships. Again, Reitan is getting this exactly backwards. The charge isn't that religion is wholly bad because of some bad examples that can be found, but rather that since religion is rotten to the core, it is easy to find examples of religious harm. The examples of terrible behaviour by religious people are illustrative of the new atheist case, not evidence for it. And again, Reitan is failing to grasp the key point here. the new atheists are targeting religion as it is practiced, not the hypothetical religion that Reitan seems to be advocating. The next section begins with Reitan musing that part of the hostility that the new atheists have towards religion is that it is a shared or communal activity, that perhaps they would be more accepting of it if it was simply a private affair. And while this might be true, it's really just an excuse for Reitan to quote more Schleiermacher about how religion must always be a social thing. Regarding the idea that religion must be kept private, Reitan argues like this. In response, Schleiermacher argues that while religion in its basic sense is a private feeling, it cannot stay comfortably private. In Schleiermacher's view, if there is religion at all, it must be social, for that is the nature of man. In fact, the impulse to association is especially strong in the case of religion, in part because of the sheer power of the religious experience. More significantly, the content of religious feeling is an impulse to communalism. How, he asks, should he wish to reserve what most strongly drives him out of himself and makes him conscious that he cannot know himself from himself alone? I'm not sure if this is Reitan seeking to add to his definition of religion by including ideas about it being expressed socially, or whether he's trying to argue that this is the behaviour that we see in believers prompted by their religious experiences. That is he still just defining his terms, or is he making an argument about how religion tends to be expressed? If it's the former, then I hardly see how it helps, as even Schleiermacher notes that, as he puts it, the nature of man is to be social, and hence any important beliefs, experiences, or activities will be social. So even false religion, or hobbies, or political beliefs, will be social experiences for most people, which means that it doesn't help to add the desire to share religious experiences to our definition. If Reitan is actually arguing that, as he calls it, true religion will be expressed communally, then this is problematic. Firstly, because he'd actually have to establish this, and since we're still in a chapter about definitions, he hasn't even shown that his version of religion actually exists. Secondly, as above, anything of importance to people will manifest in social activity, so this is hardly a meaningful distinction between religion and other aspects of the human condition. Reitan goes on to make a case that his concept of religion should be identifiable in the characteristics of the communities that form around it. That is, if people are experiencing his kind of religion, then they will tend to form communities with certain qualities. Again, he quotes Schleiermacher. For Schleiermacher, these genuine religious communities, born from the religious feeling and the desire to share it, are antithetical to any endeavouring to make others like ourselves. In such communities, each member is full of native force seeking liberty of utterance, and full at the same time of holy desire to apprehend and appropriate what others offer. And so there is no room for hostility towards divergent understanding. Schleiermacher disparages the wild mania for converting to single definite forms of religion. Reitan is smuggling supernatural connotations into a definition that he has been at pains to associate with Einstein's very neutral use of the word religion. There is nothing in the definitions given so far that ensures that any such experience of what Reitan has called piety or religion actually has any holy characteristics. But more broadly, here he is simply arguing that his conception of religion spurs people to be open and tolerant of others' religious experiences, which distinguishes itself from many more fundamentalist understandings of religion. But the main thrust here is to undermine the atheist charge that religion is harmful because it is divisive. The basic idea is that since Reitan has defined his religion as being inclusive, it is wrong to claim that all religion is divisive. Or, as Reitan puts it, seen from Schleiermacher's perspective, Dawkins' argument amounts to this. There exists this social phenomena that was originally born out of religion, understood as a feeling of piety, but which has become alienated from this source. And this social phenomenon, which has nothing to do with true religion, is a cause of violence and misery. Therefore, religion is a cause of violence and misery. But this is yet another straw man of the new atheist position. Reitan's argument here, which he again is distancing himself from by attributing it to Schleiermacher, is that there is this true religion that does not manifest itself in the way that every other thing that we call religion does. But that's like saying that anyone who claims unicorns don't exist is wrong, because I define unicorns as not necessarily having horns, and since horses exist, it's not fair to claim that unicorns can't exist. You can define religion in such a way that no one else would recognise the term, but this doesn't undermine the new atheist arguments that religion, as it is actually practiced, is a cause of violence and misery. Reitan then goes on to examine the way that atheists argue against faith. Again, he argues that they mean faith as simply stubborn belief that is indifferent to evidence and immune to rational criticism. which is only the most extreme form. At heart, faith is any belief without sufficient evidence, not just the most blind form. But Reitan either doesn't understand this or doesn't want to engage with a more nuanced definition of faith. He talks about his own church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, saying, "Is there faith in such a church? Absolutely, but not in Dawkins' sense. For the sense of faith that is present at churches like it, we need to look elsewhere. I will offer my own proposal in Chapter 8. Is this community religious? Absolutely, but not if faith in the Dawkins sense is taken to be the essence of religion." And this is one of my main frustrations with apologists in general and this book in particular. He has raised the topic of faith in order to paint the new atheist as using an unsophisticated definition, but he doesn't actually present his own. And he doesn't even defer it to, say, the next chapter, but rather to Chapter 8. I can see no other reason for bringing it up here other than to again poison the well by claiming that atheists misunderstand faith, and to set up the idea that he has some rational definition of faith, but without actually giving it. He finishes this section by acknowledging that many religious communities are precisely as bad as Dawkins or Harris or Hitchens argues, but he also wants to claim that religion need not be like that. That's fine, but I'll wait until he has actually demonstrated that, rather than just claiming it. In this section, Reitan turns his attention to Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith. He starts by calling out Harris's charge that the problems wrought by religion rest both with the fundamentalists and with the moderates. But he misrepresents Harris as arguing that they are equally to blame. This isn't what Harris, or anyone else, argues. Of course, the fanatics, or Al-Qaeda, cause more harm than your Aunt Ruth, the moderate Christian. But a general acceptance of faith as valuable and other people's beliefs as deserving respect does cause harm. Harris's argument is that the moderate religious belief that one shouldn't criticise other people's faith allows dangerous beliefs to flourish. Societies that make a virtue of faith discourage rationality, which is the only consistent defence against bad ideas. So any religious moderate who endorses these values is a problem. Not as much as a problem as the Westboro Baptist Church, but a problem nonetheless. Reitan takes issues with this, as Schleiermacher, and presumably Reitan, does seem to advocate religious pluralism. But this isn't the full story, according to Reitan. Respect for religion in all its forms does not equal respect for all those who call themselves religious, even those who behave in ways utterly at odds with what anyone moved by religious piety would do. Harris's religious extremists would be singled out by Schleiermacher as lacking authentic religiosity. From Schleiermacher's perspective, there is no religion there to respect. He would condemn it as a perversion, all the more horrific because of the essential beauty of what has been perverted. Again, Reitan can retreat into his definition of religion. According to him, true religion only motivates people to do good, so anyone who does otherwise can't really be religious. This exempts Reitan from Harris's condemnation of religious moderates. Reitan's point here is that there is a position other than religious fundamentalism and overly tolerant moderation, which is great, except that he's undermined his own arguments. Harris and others criticise people like Reitan for doing little to denounce religious fundamentalists, and so provide an environment conducive to extremism. And while Reitan disagrees with fundamentalists, it is telling that instead of addressing this book at the religious right as he originally intended, he addressed it at atheists. That is, given the choice of who to criticise, Reitan chose to focus on atheists rather than religious fundamentalists. This unwillingness to directly confront them is precisely what many atheists criticise in religious moderates. Reitan goes on to cover Harris's argument that religions don't reform from the inside, but rather from external forces. The idea here is that historically religions were more fundamentalist or scripturally literalist, and that they are forced to become more moderate by what he calls the many hammer blows of modernity. This means that, according to Harris, there is no religious basis upon which moderates can argue against fundamentalism, only a secular one. So when Reitan argues against homophobia, it's not Christianity that prompts him to do so, but a secular ethics. The conclusion of this, for Harris, is that religious moderates are stuck between their rationality, which would lead to atheism, and their faith, which would lead to fundamentalism. Reitan rejects this, saying, "We aren't led to this conclusion unless we accept the equation that Harris makes between fundamentalism and religion. Harris never considers the possibility that fundamentalism may be the perversion, that fundamentalism may be the betrayal of authentic religion. He blithely equates religion with fundamentalism, and the rest is easy. Fundamentalism is irrational, it has no resources for transcending itself. If religious moderation is born out of fundamentalism, it can only be because these moderates can't stomach fundamentalism, but are unwilling to follow reason to its conclusion. You know why many people accept the idea that fundamentalism is a more pure form of religion? Because that's what fundamentalists say, and moderates have little basis to disagree. Reitan illustrates this beautifully, as his only argument against fundamentalists so far is that they are simply doing it wrong. He has simply defined religion as not including them, and therefore they must be wrong. Any Christianity based in the Bible will struggle to argue against fundamentalism. There are few strong religious arguments against some form of biblical literalism, and so moderates are forced to reject much of the Bible teachings. This leads to what even Reitan has accepted is a strange form of Christianity. And to close the section, Reitan acknowledges that Harris isn't really attacking every form of religion as equally bad. Harris clearly acknowledges that pacifist religions like Jainism are hardly as harmful as the Abrahamic faiths, and that non-supernatural spiritual practices, while sometimes called religion, don't fall under the scope of his criticism. But instead of seeing this as Harris's fair limiting of his criticism to that which deserves it, Reitan characterises it as Harris cherry-picking his targets. This section title is another poisoning of the well, describing the new atheists' critiques of religion as mudslinging. It's also the part where Reitan undermines all of his criticisms of them. And yet, amidst all their equivocation, Dawkins and Harris get something right. Organised religions have not typically been what Schleiermacher and other religious progressives have lifted up. Schleiermacher himself admits that every real religion is corrupt in one or many ways. After all, religious communities are human ones, subject to all the failings to which humanity is susceptible. Reitan then goes on to explain, at length, how he travels more than an hour to attend the church of his choosing, despite the dozens of other churches nearby, because what he would call true religion is that rare. He also acknowledges that the reasons why he doesn't attend those other churches are because they have precisely the failings that the new atheists have identified. That is, despite spending almost all of this chapter painting atheists as misunderstanding religion, he now notes that they accurately identify the many problems that religion has as it is practiced by most people. Reitan describes choosing a church as akin to choosing a marriage partner. It's not about finding someone who's perfect, but rather about finding someone whose flaws you can live with. Since churches are human institutions, they all have failings, some more than others. Given how rare Reitan's view of religion is, he acknowledges that good partners are hard to find. Quote, "The religious world we live in may well be like a world dominated by abusive drunks. The reality is that organised religions have historically served a dangerously divisive role. The concept of heresy has shaped virtually every actual religious tradition in history. And this concept has clearly played a role in fomenting violent conflict. Sam Harris may well be right that we have the moderating power of secular culture to thank for the fact that there aren't more American churches at each other's throats." Reitan's argument here is that where atheists see all these dysfunctional religious communities and conclude that religion itself is the problem, he sees human interpretation of religion as the problem. This is, of course, based in his definition of religion as being only a pure and good influence on people. Reitan quotes Schleiermacher to make this point. In response to this hatred, Schleiermacher does not deny the pervasiveness of corruption, but asks the cultural despisers of religion to forget for once this one-sided view and follow me to another. He goes on, "Consider how much of this corruption is due to those who have dragged forth religion from the depths of the heart into the civil world. Acknowledge that much of it is unavoidable as soon as the infinite, by descending into the sphere of time and submitting to the general influence of finite things, takes to itself a narrow shell." This seems to me to be acknowledging that even if the true religion of Reitan and Schleiermacher actually exists, it will rarely be a force for good in the world, as it is, in Schleiermacher's words, unavoidable that it will be corrupted. The other problem here is that, again, I'm not sure if this is an attempt to further define what Reitan means by religion, or whether this is supposed to be an observation of the perils of creating a religious community. At best, this is just the idea that if true religion exists, we shouldn't expect a perfect manifestation of it in a church. Anyway, Reitan goes on to say that he will return to the issue of how religious communities function after he has more adequately characterised the kind of religion I want to defend. Given that we are very much at the end of the chapter in which he was supposed to define his usage of the term religion, I would have liked to have seen him more adequately characterise it by now. Reitan sums up this chapter with the following. Definitions therefore matter a great deal. We need to be careful to use our terms precisely and to acknowledge different meanings of a word. The new atheists display an all too common failure in this respect. The evils of religion, in one sense, are treated as the evils of supernatural religion in general, even though supernatural religion, in Schleiermacher's sense, is essentially opposed to the very things Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens blame it for. This is true, even though Schleiermacher's religion was neither the atheistic religion of some Buddhists, nor the impersonal deism of the Enlightenment. It was theistic, with a loving and redeeming God at its heart. It was communal, finding its fullest expression in communities of faith, but it had no room for divisiveness or blind allegiance to pronouncements from on high. And that's it for this chapter. I must say, I am very disappointed. He spent much of this chapter attacking the new atheists for not showing the care of a professional philosopher in defining their terms. But then, despite himself being a professional philosopher, Reitan does little to give a clear definition of what he means. My understanding of what Reitan means by true religion is some kind of profound feeling or experience of something much greater or beyond ourselves that motivates us to form communities to share these experiences. That these experiences impel us to contemplation of them, but it doesn't foster blind faith or an attachment to dogma. Also, it somehow has a supernatural, loving, personal God at its heart. The big problem here is that he's simply unclear. He's thrown together several characteristics of what he calls true religion, but it's not clear whether these are meant to be part of the definition or just incidental to it. For example, a rough definition of Christianity would be someone who follows the teachings of Christ as portrayed in the New Testament. While this is broad enough to admit a lot of disagreement, it gives us a good measure by which to tell whether someone is a Christian or not. In contrast, Reitan's definition gives us no such measure. Was Einstein religious by Reitan's definitions? He claims that Schleiermacher would have no quarrel with Einstein's religion, despite Einstein not believing in a personal God. But Einstein hardly belonged to a religious community, as Reitan would define one, and that seems to be a core part of Reitan's definition, so I'm left uncertain. Another problem with this definition is it seems like special pleading to claim that such a profound experience simply cannot, by definition, lead to divisiveness or exclusiveness. It seems to me that many such experiences could well lead to such things, especially if the content of such experiences seem to call for it. But this is summarily ruled out by Reitan as not true religion, simply because it leads to things he doesn't like. It's like claiming religious visions by people of your own faith are genuine experiences of the divine, but indistinguishable experiences of people of other faiths are just hallucinations. Lastly, it annoys me that he can spend 3/4 of the chapter criticising the new atheists for misunderstanding religion, before spending the last quarter acknowledging that they are exactly correct in their criticisms of almost all of how religion is actually practiced. To summarise where we are at the end of chapter 1, it seems that Reitan agrees with the new atheists that religion, as it is actually practiced by many people, is irrational and harmful. The point of difference is where the new atheists think that when you strip away all the human trappings of religious practice, you're left with nothing but empty ritual. Reitan contends that there is a rational, positive, true religion. It's just that he hasn't defined it very well yet. That's it for chapter 1. I hope you've enjoyed it. Join me next week when we look at chapter 2, the God hypothesis and the concept of God, in which he will look at defining what he means by God. Until next time, see ya.